Welcome to East Street Art's Sounds of New Briggate, a podcast series celebrating a unique and vibrant high street in the heart of Leeds, New Briggate. With each episode, we spotlight a different aspect of life on New Briggate and its fascinating history. I'm Emma Bentley-Fox, and in this episode, I'm joined by photographer and archivist Stuart Linden Rhodes, performance artist Harry Clayton-Wright, and East Street Arts' Alice Boulton-Breeze. We'll be exploring queer history, queer safety, and the future of the city centre for LGBTQ+ people. We also discuss what photography archives mean to marginalised groups and why they're so important for heritage projects. Due to the social and historical content being discussed in this episode, there are references made to homophobia and transphobia. Unfortunately, due to technical issues during recording, the first half of our discussion has been corrupted, which means we're not able to share this with you. However, as this is such an important conversation, we felt that it was still important to share what we do have with you.
We were just talking about where to kind of pick up from, and I was saying that one of my later questions was about the kind of future of all this stuff. So that's kind of where this was going, if everyone's happy to talk from that. So I'll just pose my kind of question, but then feel free to talk about whatever. So where do you see your archives going in the future? Stuart's already touched on this with this wonderful idea of the Northern Queer Museum Collection Institute, whatever it might be. So I wanted to ask if you do have plans for that. Emma, you've kind of touched on that of saying like maybe not so much, but you just know that you should document as much as you can for the future and whatever that kind of holds. And I wanted to also ask, like, do you feel like any of your work in this way has developed on its own, or do you curate and kind of direct it quite specifically? I know you've kind of touched on this as well, Stuart, with the Instagram sort of taking a life of its own, but obviously you've outputted it as books as well in exhibitions and things. And I kind of wanted to ask what your biggest ambitions were. So we've touched on some of those things, but if there's anything else you'd like to talk about in the future, maybe how you'd like other people to use them in the future, whatever that might mean, or if that's even a thing. I know you were saying, Emma, like in some ways yours is at the moment more private, like if that's ever been something you've kind of considered, or whether it will always be maybe shown in a specific curated exhibition way by yourself, for example.
I mean, I'm definitely very interested in, just come back to one of the first things you said about this queer Northern Archive as well. Like, I think I'm quite interested in that. I think there's so much interesting stuff going on in the north of England, and as someone not from the north of England, from down south, I think there's a common misconception that there isn't anything in the north of England, or particularly things like, you know, with LGBTQ stuff, that maybe it's a bit backwards up here, or we're not quite as trendy and cool as London, or not quite as, you know, free and expressive. And it's just not true, really. Actually, like, you know, all the stuff that's going on in London is going on in all other places around, you know, around the north of England. And, you know, there's things in Doncaster and Newcastle and Sheffield and Bradford. You know, there's loads of really cool stuff going on, but it's just not visible. And I think it should be visible, but I think it needs to be. I feel it would be good to be in the north of England.
And I think you're right. You know, here we are. What is it? 52 years since the first Gay Pride in London. Last year, Skipton held its first Gay Pride, and this year, Grassington held its first Gay Pride. Now, I did go to them both and photograph them just because I wanted to, you know, not for any particular reason. But, you know, putting an archive head on, which I would never have done in the olden days, it's sort of like those photographs need to survive, because in 30 years' time, in 50 years' time, somebody's going to go, there was a Gay Pride in Grassington in 2023, you know, and that was the first one, you know. So I think those sorts of things are important, that they are recorded and archived. So even though they're brand new, and people go, well, it's, you know, at what age does something belong in an archive? You know, so with your work, whilst it's new and you're archiving it so you can find your way through it, at some stage somebody's going to say, oh, well, that's an antique it belongs in an archive.
Yeah.
You know, does it have to be an antique to go in an archive?
I think that's interesting as well, actually, because like when we talk about like contemporary collecting within museums and galleries, like that's the best time in ways to collect something, because it's fresh. People know all the details about it. They know its origins and its history, and who things like ownership over images or objects. You know, when they're new, that's the best time to collect all that information. So I think that's why, for me, that's one of the reasons I've been interested in doing my archiving as I go, not just so that I can, as you say, find my way through images, and because my negatives were a mess, and it was, as an artist, it was hard for me to be able to access images and pull them out for exhibitions and shows and stuff. So that was one reason to archive, but also because of an understanding that in 5 years' time I'm going to forget where I've taken the picture or who's in the picture, or because my memory's awful.
I think even your solo show, Confessions of a Party Mum, title correct?
Yeah.
I
think about that.
Emma's wonderful solo show that's just been on at Hyde Park Art Club. It was like, for me, as a now like 7 years into like doing drag performance with my own collective Age of there was photos in there of, not of me, but of, I think, your first Party Mums night that I performed at, which for me feels like that was baby Alice in drag. And there was photos of my kind of drag sister and our drag mum of the collective, Holly and China, and like I sent them like really excited pictures and messages and was like, you have to get down to this exhibition, you're in it and you look like babies. Like it feel, and like that's not that long ago, and still the joy that we all got out of seeing that and seeing how much we've developed from that was so amazing. So it doesn't need to be 30 years exactly, you know, and it's wonderful that you've kept those things, because even at this age they're fantastic.
And things change so quickly. Like one of the other things about my archive is that you know, I was documenting and also organising, you know, parties pre-COVID, and then obviously COVID hit, and so a lot of the spaces that we were using, we weren't doing parties in gay clubs and bars because they didn't feel like spaces for us, and we didn't have kind of full control over those spaces because you know, often they're not run by queer people, or they are, but they're also, you know, home to hen parties and stag do's and all of this. So you know, we were very much working in very like one of the spaces we did a party in was called Chunk. It was a music co-op. It was run by loads of people in punk bands doing rehearsals there and using it as a gig space, and it didn't survive really through COVID. So there are lots of things like that as well, that COVID had a big impact on nightlife, and that was something that nobody saw coming. And then personally, that had such a big impact on me because I went from having health conditions and being in a fairly stable health-wise to having COVID, contracting COVID, having a couple of other illnesses, and then now out the other side of COVID being a lot more up and down with my health. And so that's impacted my ability to take photos, and also it affected the sort of spaces that I'm operating in as well. And so these are things that are very recent but quite big changes that also have significance because, you know, COVID affected everybody. So it's interesting, even in sort of recent history, how thinking about how things can change.
Harry, we're talking about archiving photographs. Are you archiving some way your performance career?
Oh, absolutely. You know, performance is so ephemeral. You know, so much effort goes into making a piece of performance or theatre. You know, the amount of people that are, you know, crafts people that work on shows, from costumers to, you know, the ways in which lighting and, you know, sound and video, all like, there's a lot of people. It takes a village to make, you know, a whole feat of performance. So you know, for what everybody's going through when we're like putting something on, at every point I'm trying to, like, you know, for my own memory, but also to capture it as beautifully as possible. I have a lovely relationship with, you know, a lot of photographers and videographers and filmmakers who will make, you know, work, you know, if it's a film shoot, we're like, you know, shooting on film that day to try and, you know, make the most of being on set, you know, or if it's a theatre show, how can we make a version of the show that's not just filmed from the back of the auditorium, but like, you know, if we shoot it in an empty theatre, maybe we can make a to camera version that, even if it just sits in my archive, there's something there that like records and documents and
I think,
commemorate what we've all
I
done
think that you're right,
together.
Harry, and I think sometimes it just does sit in your cupboard or in your the computer version of a cupboard until the world is ready to see it. But the fact that it's there, and when the time is appropriate, like my archive had to sit on the top shelf in an attic for 30 years before the world was ready to see it again, and so I think it's fantastic that you're archiving that in numerous ways. And you're right. I mean, all the bits of exhibitions and the bits I've done, the book, everything around my archive that's happened to bring it to the public has been done by an army of people around me. None of it would happen without. It's a given. It's incredible that people see it and sort of drag me screaming. You had to drag me screaming and kicking really to do the Blackpool exhibition. It was sort of like, I don't know. So yeah, there's if it hadn't been for you and Garth, this I probably wouldn't have been doing the stuff with East Street Arts and the book and all the rest. It's all these connections with people as you're going along bring an archive to life.
Well, I love the creativity as a continued conversation, and that like what we did in Blackpool felt really relevant to like this project, and bringing your work into this conversation and seeing what would happen, and knowing how important it was to kind of like restore these images that you've got and to like have them as they have been beautifully restored and then also displayed now on New Briggate, which is really, really wonderful that people get to see them. Not just people who are interested in queer work and queer materials, but that actual, passers-by and people that like wouldn't maybe not see the Instagram or not read the book can, have access to your work. And that's what's so wonderful about putting this queer archive in public spaces too. It's so carefully, presented. And yes, there are challenges within that. There were in Blackpool, and I'm aware, obviously there have been too, but that's, part and parcel of like, queering a space, queering a street.
I think it was really important to me. It was very difficult in terms of permissions with like building owners and other things that I won't go into because it's very boring, but I wanted to, ideally I would have like plastered that street with your photos, and it would have been like, you can't not like experience this street kind of being queered or whatever, and it wasn't quite possible to do it like that, but I'm really happy with what we have done. And it was really important for me as well, because I think even though that there's so many great things about having your archive on the Instagram, and in a way it is in theory open to anyone, there's also the kind of evil side of all of this stuff, which is that there are algorithms made by heterosexual cis white men mainly, in working for Mark Zuckerberg, who is a dubious person, and they are designed to quieten the voices of kind of marginalized people, and they actively stop people seeing content created by queer people, by Black people, by sex workers, by whatever activists. And so like for me it was so important to have it on the street, because that, I know not everyone will use that street, but like the criteria for seeing that work was just being in that street, and then you can choose to engage with that more and come onto our website and see even more photos and go onto your Instagram. And it's hopefully a way that like escapes some of that kind of algorithmic stuff as well from the kind of Instagram
I think
world.
That's interesting actually as well, thinking about where we access those images, because if you think about how people use Instagram and what it's like as a platform for people and for people's mental health as well. People are like consuming content so quickly. You see something, then you scroll and you see something else, and within a second you've forgotten what you even looked at. So it is great because you have such a wide audience there and people can see it, but also like having it in a high street where people can stop. They're not expecting to see something. They can take a look, slow down, walk back another day, tell people to go and have a look, like, and also thinking about other ways in even like something like a photo book where you could sit in the comfort of your own home on a sofa, or maybe in a library, or in a bar or something, and you go through things slowly and you talk about it, and those are really nice ways of being able to share archives.
Yeah.
I mean, I think books are a great way of being able to share an archive, because yes, you have to purchase it and own the book, so there's a bit of a barrier there for people. But then once you do, in terms of thinking about like ownership, you own that as a document, as an artifact, and you can do whatever you like with it.
Yeah, I think a book, you know, when you publish a book, it's there, it's permanent, isn't it? It's a historical document that's permanently there and accessible as a book. Having the exhibitions on the street, I think, is fantastic, because, like you say, people who wouldn't have gone to a museum or a gallery to see it might be just busy walking down the street doing the shopping, and just out of the corner of their eye go, oh, what's that? And then look into, and then see another one, and so you get that. But then you expose the exhibition to people who wouldn't have seen queer photography or just, let's call it photography, before. I had an interesting experience this week. I was approached and asked if I would take a group of queer immigrant group around my exhibition. So there were language barriers, because a few of them didn't speak very much English at all, but they had interpreters with them, which was fantastic. And I walked them through the exhibition on New Briggate. And it was fascinating, because the questions that they were asking me about the photographs and about queer life and gay life in the 1990s and before that, they'd no idea about Section 28, and about, you know, they just assumed that being gay was perfectly legal, always had been, and that everything was rosy in the garden in Britain. Because this is the land of milk and honey, and they were shocked to find out about the legal history of being gay in the UK. You know, that when I was 16, I was illegal. You know, I could have gone to jail. You know, and that sort of thing. And they were gobsmacked by that sort of that detail, and so they were asking quite interesting questions, and questions that you don't get from an English audience, because they know that history.
It's interesting actually that you say that, because I think I know that we're doing this Section 28 project with Hold Up Collective as well, but I found that a lot of people don't know that history in the UK, particularly around Section 28, and maybe people of my generation as well, where, I mean, when I was at school, Section 28 had technically, well, it was ended, but it had a knock-on effect for years afterwards. That it's still LGBTQ stuff. And for people who don't know what Section 28 is, it was a piece of legislation that Margaret Thatcher brought in that essentially prohibited teachers and government services from promoting homosexuality. So it was really just not mentioned at all. And I know that for me, even at school, that had a knock-on effect of not seeing that in the curriculum. So there is this, like, you know, legally there's these histories have been erased as well.
It forced me to create the character of Linden. That's how Linden came about, so that it didn't come into conflict with my day job.
I think it's worth mentioning at this point as well, like the new legislation that is coming in from the government about how teachers address trans issues with pupils at school. Like, I don't think it's over the top to say, like, will lead to incredible harm in young people. So for people who are listening who don't know what that is, the government are looking at bringing in the idea that if children disclose anything about gender, questioning gender fluidity, that they believe that they are trans or want to explore that, or they're questioning anything, or that they are trans, and we'll have to take that through like a safeguarding process, and we'll have to disclose that to their parents, which is going to force a lot of people to not be able to openly talk in school, which is should be a safe place. So, you know, it's scary to see that those ideas are coming back again. And I think, you know, obviously this is slightly on a tangent from kind of the archiving thing, but I think it's great, like, to have your images on New Briggate. It's like, to see that joy and stuff, you go, like, we aren't in a situation that, yes, we don't have Section 28 anymore, and yes, there's less people using open slurs on TV or whatever, but like, there are still just so many other things going on, and so much of that is targeted at the trans community at the moment as well, which is just...
I mean, I think it's important also to mention about the image, one of the images in the exhibition being removed as well and like deliberately defaced. And for me, that just sums up exactly why it's so important to have those images in public space, because we've just had Pride in Leeds. You know, this happened over a weekend where in theory everyone's meant to be coming together to celebrate LGBTQ communities,
and someone's purposely pulled down
deliberately
one of the pictures
pulled it
twice.
Yeah, so I wasn't surprised when it happened, and we had a minor version of that in Blackpool, didn't we? With one of the images that was graffitied with homophobic slur, and the picture on New Briggate that was torn down not once but twice. But since we've put it back a third time and raised it higher out of physical reach
and wallpaper
pasted it to the wall, it's surviving.
It's not coming down now.
No.
So I wasn't surprised by it, and I'm not upset by it either. It's to me, that's a sign that society is interacting with it.
Yeah, I mean,
it may
people
not
have
be
taken notice.
Yeah, people are taking notice, and it may not be in a positive way in that respect, but it's pricking somebody.
Yeah.
And it might just have a positive effect on somebody further down the road.
And I do wonder whether, because the first incident was kind of around Pride weekend, I also do wonder whether people specifically go out to do these kind of things on events like Pride weekend to kind of, I don't know, register their disdain at the whole situation, you know. And I know in previous years I've had friends who've been assaulted or been involved in like incidents where it seemed like the people doing that were purposely going out over Pride weekend. So I think, you know, us launching it, which, you know, we wanted to be part of that kind of big celebration. So I'm glad we did do that, but I wonder if that maybe got some different interest.
I think I would agree with what you said, Stuart. I wasn't surprised by it, but it is disappointing because you just think like
walk
like
away.
Really? Do you need to like?
Yeah, it's sad, isn't it? You know, that you're a sad little person for doing
and
it.
it's the kind of thing that like people are, you know, there's an anonymity to it where it's like they can do that and they can get away with it because there's really no way of us knowing who's done that. Yeah. And I think that's what's happened. That's what I see when I think about homophobia in the UK now, maybe versus 10-20 years ago, is it's so much more covert, but it's still there.
Yeah, definitely.
You mean we forced the homophobics into the closet?
Underground.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they are banging on the doors. They want to be let out.
So I've kind of got to the end of like the things that I'd sort of prepared, I guess. One thing I was just quite interested in is there any kind of photographers, archivists, photography archives that have ever inspired you, maybe kind of intentionally, or like you've been aware of that, or you've sought that out, or maybe you just actually realised that, I don't know, you've been carrying that with you, or is it since you've kind of realised that you've become an artist and an archivist without meaning to, maybe? I don't know, have you ever looked to anyone else's work? Or I know that you've done quite a few talks with Emma, worked with Harry quite a bit, like you said, taken other groups on talks. Like, I don't know, through those processes, have you learned from other people anything that's kind of really stuck with you?
It's been fascinating meeting other people and talking to them about how they archive, what they're doing with materials, how they're using them, developing them. Photographer-wise, photographers are a very strange bunch. They don't like to share anything. They don't want anybody to see what settings they're using on their camera, what lens they're using, so that when it comes to actually taking pictures, they can be very, very, very scary. So you tend to have to go to the work of the photographers and look at how they've composed photographs, how they've taken, you know, what positions, the lighting that they're using. I have a friend who was a porn movie maker called William Higgins, who's deceased. And he was huge, a massive force in America, particularly through the 70s. And all of his work was studio based. And he invited me along. So I was doing an interview with him for Gay Times magazine, and he invited me along and said, "Why don't you bring your camera, and you can just take some photographs over the day." So I photographed the filmmaker while he was filming, and it was incredibly fascinating and incredibly boring. Who knew that making a porn movie could be so boring? But it is, because it's all a studio, and it's lights and rigging and positioning, and and it takes forever. So circling around the studio, getting pictures of Bill doing his work was quite fascinating. But the thing that he paid me one of the biggest compliments I've ever had with photography, which was he can't take a photograph or a film without it being lit properly in a studio with the sets, or everything has to be perfect and in place, and then it's roll cameras or take the pictures. And he said to me, he said, I can't do what you do. I can't capture the moment. I can't walk around with a camera like you and just capture the moment. He said, it's incredible what you do. Now, I couldn't do what he does. I couldn't do, or did. I can't do that studio photography. I haven't the patience for it. I like to do, like, I never pronounce the names right. The French photographer Dessonneau, street photographer, and Sutcliffe, who some of his pictures were posed, but quite a few of them weren't. Street photographer in the Whitby photographer. I like their types of photographs and how they position themselves and where they do it, and suddenly dive in. And I love the work of Bruce Weber, the way he captures the action and the movement of people in his work. So I learned sort of, how did they take that photograph? And I find that quite interesting. But as I say, the difference between studio photography and street photography, which is basically what my stuff is, be it in a bar or a club, it's still technically street photography. There's an art to that. You have to have a patience. You've got to wait. You might spot the perfect place, but you've got to wait for the right people to wander through it. So you've found the light, you've found the corner. You just need the right people to wander through, and then you just suddenly dive in and click the camera and hopefully you've got the picture.
I think that's exactly what I find exciting about taking pictures, particularly on film as well, because you don't have a screen, so you don't know necessarily what you're going to get. It is such a gamble, and I love that feeling of like walking around a space and like plucking out different spots and thinking, okay, this would look nice with a little portrait here, or this, and then waiting for those moments, like you say, to happen and getting them and thinking, check, got that one. That looks good. That I know that's going to be a good image, and that's really exciting. There's a flexibility there and a creativity that you have to have as a photographer to recognize those sort of incidents that you potentially could capture. But I think in terms of photographers that I like, I mean, you've just named quite a lot of really interesting photographers, but I was never taught photography. I did go to uni and did study art and design, but I was never really taught photography. But in some ways I feel like I'm a bit anti-photography. I sometimes don't like being called a photographer as well, just because I think my practice is broader than that. And yes, I am a photographer, but I don't want to get pigeonholed as just a photographer. And I don't really know what I'm doing a lot of the time. I shoot on a point and shoot, so I don't bother with lenses or anything really. Like if I really wanted to set up some images with lenses and lighting stuff, I could do that. But for me, I'm much more interested in shooting point and shoot film, and like often my images are blurry or there are fingers on the lens, and but for me that's part of my my practice and my aesthetic, and I'm very interested in those moments of blurriness and haziness, and that feels quite immediate, and I like a very bright flash. And I know that there's a tradition of that as well within photography, and it's a very sort of punk DIY aesthetic.
Yeah, that was one of the things for me. All my 90s photography was on film. So like you don't know what's in the camera until they get the film developed. So you do get some of the blurry pictures. Well, because I was photographing for magazines, All Points North, based here in Leeds, and Gay Times, those blurry pictures were never going to make it into the magazine. but having the negatives now and looking back at them, I'm putting some of them on Instagram because there's an etherealness to them, and the smokiness. You know, people in those days, you'd got cigarette smoke to contend with, and you'd got the darned fog machine of the DJ pumping out, and you'd be cursing because you'd just go to get a picture and suddenly they'd disappear in a cloud of smoke from the DJ, and you curse you know. But when you look at them now, having digitized them, thanks to the power of digital apps, you know, you can, you know, with Photoshop and things, you can actually decrease the smoke. You can take that off a little bit, but without losing the image. I mean, that's one of the things about my photographs that I am protective of, is when we come to clean them up, I don't want them to lose their authenticity, their age. You could clean them up so they look like they were taken yesterday and be immaculate, and they would lose all interest for me, and I think for anybody else. They've got to keep the smokiness, the odd scratch from the negative, that sort of thing. That's, as long as they, some of them need cleaning up a bit because the negatives are incredibly old. But as long as they keep their age and their authenticity, then I'm okay. But if somebody came along and turned them into and stripped them of their character and their soul, I wouldn't be happy.
Yeah, I was really glad actually when we were doing the restoration work and you'd said that, because I felt the same about those things, because for me that's what gives photos character, and the texture and the noise is interesting.
It's a bit like Antiques Roadshow, isn't it? How many times do you hear that somebody's had a cabinet that would have been worth thousands of pounds and they've had it restored to the point where it's worth a few hundred? You know, and I think there's that element to it.
I also really like with the haziness of certain images, and you'd said it as well, but like I'm finding sometimes I go back to things and I can get a roll of film, and like there's a few images I've got as well that are some of my favourite images I've taken there, where they're so hazy and blown out that they become quite ambiguous, and there's something very queer about that to me, because you lose sense of bodies as singular or collectives, and gender, and all these different sort of things that we identifying markers that we use to kind of put people into categories and boxes. And when you've got these images that are so like blur, they feel quite queer in their expansiveness and the possibility of those images, and I'm quite interested in that as well, actually.
I think something that you said, Stuart, about like the blurry ones would never end up in a magazine. I think you were saying about like the responsibility you feel of this archive, but like it is yours, and like it is, if those images are important to you and you want to share them, like you are free to do that now, because they don't have a functional purpose anymore. So it's nice to celebrate that. In the last kind of 5 minutes, I wondered, did you have any kind of final thoughts you wanted to add, Harry, or anybody else?
I guess just sitting here and listening to you talk is so fascinating, the two of you, the different but also similar approaches. But one thing that seems like a commonality to me is that instantaneously when you're capturing nightlife is the connection that you're both able to have with people so quickly, the trust that you're able to build, and the joy that you both capture in those like environments. And I just think it's testament to who you both are, that like in such a short space of time, because that's all you get in that environment to capture people. They're very, very fleeting moments that you're able to have such a powerful connection. And I imagine quite a lot of that is non-verbal. And I was just wondering if you could both speak on what that process is like, you know, to kind of meet people and how you get such a connection with people, because these subjects and how much it feels like they share with you, their eyes, the joy, you know, that feels so special.
Yeah, there was one particular person stands out in mind. We called him Mad James back in the day, and he saw me at the Blackpool exhibition, and he came up to talk to me about how when I'd been taking photographs in the early days, people were very suspicious. Who is this person without taking our pictures? What for? And people would quite happily come up to you and say, what you're taking pictures for? And so you would say, I'm taking pictures for Gay Times or All Points North or whatever. Oh, right, okay, will you take my picture type of thing. And eventually it got to the point where I was seen so often that I was no longer seen. You became, oh, it's him again with the camera. And to the point then they didn't even think that. I was just there. And people might come up and talk to you and have a drink with you. But because they were so relaxed around you, you became another one of the crowd. And they stopped seeing the camera. So you were able to get quite close in and take those photographs. And they didn't stiffen, people, when they know they're having the picture taken, they stiffen up, don't they? They put a silly pose on or a silly smile or whatever. But that stopped happening. And I thought that was a really nice compliment, that it had gone from who's that chap with the camera to over a few years or months even, just being the anonymous guy with the camera. Oh, that's Stuart, thank you very much, taking pictures. It's okay. We can forget him, it's all right, relax.
I think consistency, like you say, is key for building trust, and having your face around and being recognisable, and people start to get to know who you are. But for me also, there's something about it being collaborative and mutual, and being vulnerable yourself, so that you're building that relationship with people. So sometimes, that means for me, like me being in pictures, or me like helping to set up a shot, or just like getting to know people and chatting to people as well before you take their picture, and explaining to them who you are and why you're doing it, why you're interested in it, and also involving people in image making as well. Like sometimes when I shoot, recently I shot out in Bradford, which is a drag night, and they really prioritise and platform sort of kings and things, and doing headshots with the performers before they go on, and then getting shots of them as they perform, but really involving them in that process, like asking them questions like, right, what's your character, what, tell me, give me a bit of backstory, like what kind of vibe are we going for, and asking them, showing them what I'm thinking, and saying, do you like that, and really making an image together, I think is a great way of building trust, and also getting great images as well. But also something else that I thought of when you said that, and you've mentioned this before, but there's an element also of performance as a photographer as well. And Stuart, you taught for years, so this as well, but like when you're teaching or doing engagement work, or working with an audience of some kind, you've got to really be quite charismatic in a way, and grab people's attention and build trust. And I think you being a teacher is testament also to your ability to do that.
You can't be a wallflower if you're taking photographs. You've got to pull out that confidence and have a bit of charisma about you to make yourself put the proposed subject at ease. Particularly if you're capturing a moment and you're taking their picture mid flow in a dance or something, and you've used a flash, and they go, oh. And they why have you taken my picture? You've got to be, they might be a little bit on edge, so you've got to be disarming, and say, oh, it's, if you don't want me to use it, don't worry, So, yeah.
And I think understanding like what people want from an image, like especially with like gender stuff, like quite often people can feel quite uncomfortable in their own bodies or their own skin, and as queer people in nightlife spaces, you have an opportunity there to be the person that you want to be, that maybe it doesn't feel safe or comfortable to in your everyday life. So as a photographer, getting to work with them to capture an image, to capture that moment for them, is so magical and special when you can get that right, and where they're like, God, you've seen me, how I feel inside, and you've got a physical piece of evidence to say that I can be that person and that I am that person. That's really special, I think. This podcast was a conversation between Emma Bentley-Fox, Stuart Linden Rhodes, Harry Clayton-Wright and Alice Boulton-Breeze, and was produced by East Street Arts. Hidden Histories of New Briggate is supported by Leeds City Council and Historic England as part of the New Briggate High Street Heritage Action Zone Regeneration Programme. To find out more about the project, visit www.eaststreetarts.org.uk.